Hi, everyone. Welcome back to a very special episode of Coffee with Innovate Finance. This is part of our D&I series, which we kickstarted in March this year, and we spoke about women in fintech. Today, we will be discussing disability inclusion with Rhiannon Parker, CIO of the Valuable 500. Rhiannon, welcome. How are you today?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me and joining the conversation.
Oh, well, we're very happy to have you here as well. So I'd like to kickstart. Could you tell us a bit about yourself, your background and your career to date?
Yeah, absolutely. So I sit as Chief Innovation Officer at the Valuable 500. Just for a bit of a background, I spent the bulk of my career in risk management consulting. So for a long time, the focus was on the energy sector and most recently in travel and tourism. And now at the Valuable 500, I have really the privilege of having a front row seat to 500 of the world's best businesses. So I absolutely love that. I've always really loved exploring aspects of corporate psychology that sit at functional intersections within a business. So looking at things like risk management and diversity and inclusion and the benefits that these interactions have for the organization. So that's kind of one of my passion areas and things I'm interested in. And at the Valuable 500, people always wonder, what does that mean, Chief Innovation Officer? So for us, obviously, we need to innovate ourselves. But a big part of my job is focusing on convening innovation and accelerating innovation within the 500. So connecting them, bringing them together and helping accelerate the pace at which we are doing the work that we do. I don't get to spend as much time as I like on this, but I also love looking at radical innovation, kind of horizon scanning for new accessible technology, ways of working, and things like that.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much. It sounds like a very exciting role and something, you come across very passionate about as well. And I want to touch on about radical innovation a bit later on, if I may. Could you tell us in your own words, what is the Valuable 500 and why did you want to join them?
Yeah, so I think we're in an evolution of what the 500 is. So just to give a bit of context, so Caroline Casey is our founder. Caroline has sight loss, and so that's made up a big part of her life and her experience of working in the business world, right? So 3 years ago, she had this vision or this idea to challenge 500 of the world's biggest companies and their CEOs to actually do something about this and commit to change. So at that time, the first CEO that stood beside her with that goal or with that campaign was Paul Pullman. And it's just pretty incredible to me what the team was able to achieve in a very short period of time. So last year on May 18th, they achieved the 500. And I just think that's absolutely incredible. So the first part of our story was about that campaign and about that activation of this global community of CEOs. And now as we've transitioned into phase 2 of what we are all about and what we're here to do, this is really looking at the transformation program and activating these 500 companies and the 22 million employees that they represent to help us and make this change happen.
I mean, that is such a phenomenal achievement as well. So was the idea that these 500 companies initially sort of pledge, and now phase 2 is about, what they need to sort of do? How does that work?
Absolutely. So the requirement was that they made one firm and actionable commitment specific to their business in regard to how they were going to contribute to change, right? So I think, there's lots of pledges and checklists and things out there. But for Caroline and the team that she built around her in the first phase of this, it was all about making sure this is about commitment and, a desire to really play a part in driving change.
And is it, so, you talked about sort of, 500 companies, and are these typically in the FTSE, and they're larger companies, or is it a combination of smaller companies as well?
Yes, absolutely. So we have really significant representation within the FTSE 100, others as well, the Nikkei. So these are some of the world's best companies. And I think what's also important to point out is that within the 500 companies, we have 15 iconics that we call them iconic leaders that are co-developing and supporting the development of the solutions we're working on. So these are groups like Apple, Google, Deloitte, Microsoft just joined as our 15th iconic. So these are, our most well-known and well-loved brands globally that are committed to this.
And is it around disability specifically, or do you cover other areas of D&I?
So I think this is something that we feel really passionate about. The first and foremost, it's absolutely about disability, and I wish that it was a different scenario. The reality is that we have so much work to do in this space. We really have our work cut out for us. But what is important to recognize is that this isn't an either or thing. This isn't moving the dial on racial equity or making the workplace better for our LGBTQIA community or women or whatever it is. This is intersectional, and it's not an either or thing. A lot of the principles that we apply in regard to the work that we're doing benefit all of those different facets of diversity, inclusion, and equity.
Okay. And when you work with these companies, what would you say are the challenges for them?
There are many. I'm just going to be honest with that. I think, one of the biggest challenges is fear, right? So fear about not getting it right, fear of, I think we live in a cancel culture right now that's very intimidating, represents significant reputational risk to organizations. And so there's a lot of trepidation about even, making public the work that they're doing, even when it's great work that's being done. So one of the biggest challenges is this fear of getting it wrong. There's, even things down to nomenclature and language. Is it okay to say the word disability? That's a significant impediment to progress. So, there's that. I think the complexity of disability, when we're looking at the pan disability community, it's very broad, it's very diverse, looking at individuals with cognitive disabilities versus the deaf community, the mobility community. It's a very complex space, so it has to be well thought out, and it's hard work. So those are just a couple, but really significant ones.
Yeah, I mean, do you then help and support the companies to, one from an education area, but then also from a implementation as well? Is that the work that you focus on as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're there to meet them where they are. Everybody's at a different part of their journey, but to help them understand how to collectively work towards action, right? So to connect with others that have maybe been doing this work for a number of years, understanding the perspectives, looking at things like the global legislative landscape and how to overcome some of those challenges. Fundamentally, we are not consultants. We are not here to kind of consult and do that type of work. We are conveners and connectors. So it's very important to us to connect the Valuable 500 with experts within the disability community, entrepreneurs, innovators, to make sure that the disability community is involved in different aspects of how we move forward. But yes, there is definitely an element of awareness and helping them understand what the key areas of focus should be.
Okay. And I understand that you've launched a mentor program. Could you talk us through, what is the mentor program?
Yeah, this is something that we're really proud of. This was just announced in Davos at the World Economic Forum. So the program is called Generation Valuable, or Gen V for short. And Gen V is representative of this new kind of up and coming group of amazing disabled talent that are working within the organizations, working within the 500 and outwards, and connecting them with the C-suite and executive level to make sure that they find their way up to the C-suite, because that's one of the big problems, is that there is very little disabled representation in C-suite or executive roles. So it's a program to connect them and really break down some of those barriers with their progression through the organization.
On that point, are companies sort of measuring, or do they understand in terms of how many people identify as disabled? Is there enough stats out there in terms of, especially with, you've got the 500 companies, is that something that they would then report on? And is that something that you would advocate for in terms of collating that data set?
Yeah, absolutely. So you've touched on probably one of the single most important things that we're doing at this time. It connects to other things, but we believe that data is central to everything that we're doing. Unfortunately, that data in particular is very, very complex, right? So it is very important for companies to understand the composition of their workforce and what percentage of their workforce self-identify as disabled. But getting to that data is a process, right? So first and foremost, it starts with creating a culture of trust and transparency so that the disabled employees understand what the intent is with that data, how, what is it, what's in it for me? Why are you actually collecting this? Is this just about compliance, or is this about care? Is this, because you care? And so when we see organizations that have undertaken this process of surveying, or, for those that self-identify as disabled, we see data that is incomplete or not accurate, and they are all kind of working on this journey. We also see, and this really applies to our ecosystem within finance, we see this data not being at a point that it's investor grade data, right? So when we're looking at accuracy, completeness, and timeliness, it's really tough to get to that point. But there are some amazing initiatives and amazing work going on within the 500 to tackle this. And get to a better place where we can actually harmonize this data and really benchmark it within and amongst peers.
Could you give us an example of where it is really sort of working?
Yes. So we've seen quite a number of our companies that have, committed to this as a journey. So starting out with an internal survey type mechanism, asking their employee base, who self-identifies as disabled, and really providing a lot of transparency and clarity in regard to what they're doing with that. And so we're seeing some numbers that are much higher than some of the other, statistics that we're seeing, right? So if we know that 15% of the world's population lives with a disability, when you see very low statistics, it's disproportionate, right? So we've seen some examples of companies reporting 6 and 7% and seeing year-on-year increases, which are indicating that they're getting this right, they're getting the messaging right, and their employees trust them enough to provide that data.
Fantastic. And is there a different, because some of the early stage startups that I speak to, specifically in fintech, would you say it's more difficult if you're a later stage sort of company or an established company to get hold of the data or to implement some of these changes versus an early stage? And what advice would you give to both?
So I don't think it's necessarily harder. I think I think some of these early stage startups, they're hesitant to implement these types of processes from the beginning because it's like, oh, well, there's just 10 of us, or, they maybe make the assumption when they look around the room that, nobody is disabled. And so this is where it's really important to recognize, how prevalent non-visible disabilities are. Looking at things like neurodiversity. So I think there's a hesitance to formalize these types of systems right in the beginning. We tend to see these happen more as companies mature and evolve. So I don't think it's necessarily tougher or anything like that, but I think in this space, it's also really important to look at accessibility, right? So this isn't just about disability inclusion in regard to our employees, it's the accessibility of our products and services. So when you're developing an app, when you're coding, when you are, releasing a new, offering, has accessibility been thought out from the beginning so that you're actually including the 15% of the population in the actual use of that, right? So one thing that we talk a lot about is products and services being born accessible. Our chief product officer loves that, and it's really just kind of influenced a lot of us and our thinking on that. So you think about how much better it is to have something be born accessible and proactively been engineered to meet the needs of everyone, as opposed to retroactively having to go back and fix that problem. And so that applies to products and services, but also our culture, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, from your point of view, especially, do you feel that, the tech companies are doing that now? Do you feel that there's a lot more that needs to be done in that area? Because I remember in the past, certain products, were designed and they didn't take into consideration, whether it's disability or other scenarios as well. Do you feel now that there is a change within the tech community and an awareness?
Yeah, I think that there's an awareness, and I think, groups like Apple have been doing this in regard to inclusive design since the 1980s. So they're incredible at this. And we've seen Microsoft and others make great advances internally and culturally, looking at making sure that their developers are well versed in principles of accessibility and designing things from the get-go. Also making use of the disability community and their perspective. So welcoming them into research and design, and these different things. But, despite that optimism, there is still a tremendous amount of work to do. Like, even looking at things like the percentage of web pages globally that are just inaccessible or, don't work properly for the assistive tech or screen readers or things that people need to use to be able to consume information digitally. We still have a very, very long way to go there.
Yeah. And so for those that are, founders and CEOs that are listening in, what advice would you give to them to make sure that their firms are more inclusive as well, but also, the products that they're developing are more inclusive?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think back to my earlier comment, I think my advice would be to start somewhere, right? It's okay to not have it all figured out. Just, starting somewhere is better than the silence or, not progressing. We talked about this the other day, this focus on progress and not perfection is a big thing. But also for them to take stock of how important it is for them personally to break the silence on disability. I think, we've talked about these statistics on the percentage of people that live with a disability, but when we look at our proximity to disability, that number goes up exponentially. So, parents of autistic children, carers of somebody with another type of disability, our proximity to disability is all around us. And they have a tremendous role to play in breaking the silence on disability. So we talk about this a lot, even in regard to, the CEOs globally. There's only a very finite number of people that are willing to talk about this openly, looking at Branson talking about dyslexia or Elon Musk talking about neurodiversity. Statistically, we know that there are many more affected or that have lived experience with disability. So it would just be incredible to see this C-suite silence broken.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think also from a hiring perspective as well. And do you have a viewpoint on that in terms of organizations to change how they are hiring talent so it is more inclusive?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, that's kind of like the first gate into the organization, right? And so inclusive hiring practices and the use of technology is going to be increasingly important to look at, even when we're looking at things like bias in AI, but also down to the language, right? Like, is the language you're using inclusive? If you're saying to somebody, you must have excellent written and verbal communication. Well, if somebody has manual dexterity issues, like how important is that written element? Is there a different way to say that doesn't alienate somebody from even or deter them from applying for that role? So I think it's important to make sure that we have boundaries to this, and you could exhaust yourself day in and day out just trying to figure this all out. So start somewhere and make steps. But yeah, I think it's critically important at that stage of interacting with talent.
Yeah. I want to hear a bit more about this term you used earlier on about radical innovation. Well, firstly, what does that mean? What does it mean to you? But what would you like to see in terms of the industry? How do you see that evolving?
Yeah, so this is a funny one. I feel like I could go on a big tangent here, so I'm trying to stay on.
Oh no, please do.
On point with you here, but I absolutely love it. I think okay, so here's an example. And this touches on something really important. I think the disability community does not get the credit it deserves ever for being early adopters, for the innovation through which they operate on a day-to-day basis, just out of necessity to solve problems that the world presents, right? And so, when you look at something like there's a blind astrophysicist, and she, found that she was basically needed to process large volumes of data on black holes and, all the amazing work that she's doing. But she needed a different way to process that data. So she was a massive contributor in regard to sonifying data. So taking data from being uniquely in a visual modality to letting us hear it, and making sense of that data. And what we saw with her kind of pioneering work in that space is that many of her peers benefited from that, right? So this gets to universal design principles, like a dropped curb or a ramp may have been initially designed for the disability community, but how many of us benefit from that dramatically? We see that with voice notes and all of the different things we're seeing come out in the digital space. So I love this idea of going into a boardroom and not 99.9% of the boardrooms right now just are 100% visual data. It's based on visual data. But if sighted peers have ears as well and can listen to data, why wouldn't we be exploring some of those other modalities that are more inclusive, right? So I don't know what you think about that, if that resonates with you, but that's one that's very exciting to me. To look at other ways that everybody benefits from, but is more inclusive in a business context.
Wow. I mean, I'll be completely honest. I've never thought of it like that. And I think that there's a challenge, right? Because we're not having conversations about this, about what this means to, different people in terms of whether it is how we communicate, how we present things. And this is where that area of being inclusive is so important, because, almost if you have, say if you're not blind or you're not deaf, you just take it for granted of how we are supposed to live our life. But actually, you're absolutely right. In order for it to be more inclusive, but it also gives a different perspective, right? So you mentioned, the dropped curb, that also benefits those, with prams.
Yeah, me as a young mother, I benefited from that, time and time again, and was so thankful it was there, right? And so I know that there are the digital, corollaries of this as well, that where we see so many examples of universal design benefiting us all. I think as the metaverse as well, right? Like as we approach this as this digital twinning and like all of these different things start becoming more mainstream, has accessibility been factored into this, right? And what potential does this have to leave a really significant portion of the population behind as we progress in that direction? So those are some fundamental questions in regard to radical innovation.
And do you see a real opportunity there with the metaverse in terms of how we now design our systems going forward?
Yes, I mean, if I'm honest, I think it can lead me towards existential ponderings that are, I don't know what to say about it. It scares me in some ways, but it in equal measure excites me if we get it right, and I think there are some really exciting possibilities, and even looking at things like haptic technology. And so this is where, you'll have like a sensory input coming in via a vest or something on your finger to indicate that something's happened, right? Like, what potential does that have to make life better for others, or increase not really increase, but just better the way that we work together? I think there's some really significant possibilities there.
Wow. I mean, yeah, you definitely got me thinking. So I'm sure you've got the listeners thinking as well. If I could grant you a wish or 3 wishes, what would that be for you in this space?
So I'm going to stick to, to the conversation at hand and the industry at hand. I would love to see investors and VCs and, others factoring accessibility into, funding and decision making, right? Like, if a product is not accessible, or, a culture is not really inclusive, I would like to see that be a major factor in decision making. And I would like to see, some groups actually differentiating themselves in that regard, and see whether that plays out from an ROI perspective, or, helps them out. I think that would be incredible.
I just want to touch on the VC point. Is that around more in terms of when they're looking to invest in companies and they're looking at their sort of ESG credentials? Would it fall under that, or would it be seen as something separate?
Yeah, absolutely. So just in regard to due diligence, right? So, if you're going to invest in something or support it, why would you want to do that if it's not accessible from the outset? Because that, chances are you're going to have to fix that problem later, and that's going to cost money, right? It also represents significant risk in regard to consumer activism and things like this that are now significant factors for organizations. I would love to see disability really recognized under the S of ESG. I think we're seeing so many companies commit wholeheartedly to the E of ESG and really moving the dial in significant ways. When we look at social, there's actually functional categories for disability to be considered, and really, effort put towards making a difference there. We just are not seeing that happen. I think ESG has laid the groundwork in regard to expectations at the board level and with other stakeholders, and I would love to see disability kind of formally recognized in that space. That would make me really happy. And a third one, it just gets back to leadership, right? So just seeing people have courage to break the silence, like we talked about. So break the silence on their proximity to disability, lived experience, whatever that may be, or support of it, just because it's the right thing to do.
3 great wishes. And 3 great takeaways, actually, that people can then ponder on, but also create awareness, but also act on as well. So if a company wants to be part of the valuable 500,
so we've achieved the 500. So that, that piece of it is closed, essentially. So we're really focusing on mobilizing the 500 and working towards this. But there's a wide community of disability experts and organizations working to make things more accessible and disability inclusive. So I think even just a simple Google search on some of this stuff is an amazing place to start.
So a huge thank you to our guest, Rhiannon. Thank you for sharing your insights, your feedback, but also your passion. And a huge thank you to our listeners. If you want to find out a bit more, do go to our website, innovatefinance.com. And for any other episodes of Coffee with Innovate Finance. And until next time, bye for now.